let's talk a little bit about cover this time of year. I hear the term like thermoregulation or thermal cover being brought up, and a lot of times that coincides with like a cedar or a pine, those type of evergreens, hemlocks and stuff like that. Did you want to hit on that as far as maybe what you might be looking for and some of the benefits for this time of year with that?
So yeah, when you get further north, cover means something a little different, and even in some areas, deer will even yard during the winter, where they gather up together in an area that's good thermal cover, like in a young stand of conifer trees that really protects from snow and wind and cold, and they'll gather up like that. Now, I've never hunted in an area like that, but I understand from folks that know how deer operate in those areas that yes, that's what winter cover often means during the worst weather. For most of the country, southeast and the east, cover for deer mostly means escape cover, hiding cover, and it can be in the form of early successional cover that you're trying to produce because you're trying to produce the forage. If you go out there and you put sunlight on the ground, and you can do it simply by letting a food plot go fallow and don't mess with it, just let it grow up. It's going to grow up in some natural and native plant species that deer browse, but it's also going to grow up in native grasses and things like broom sedge and Indian grass, switchgrass, and all kinds of stuff that will come up naturally. Deer don't eat those things, but forbs and things that they do eat mix in with that, and together it all forms great cover. So an old field that's just grown up fallow, that's thick cover from your neck down, is ideal deer cover. So you're often producing quality cover just by trying to produce forage, by putting sunlight on the ground, by disturbing that with fire, setting back succession, letting that grow up, keeping it from becoming shady again. Now, yeah, so other areas up north, you're talking about stands of conifers and things like that. But in the end, deer will use whatever cover they can. If you're looking at a canopy forest, closed canopy where there's no sunlight reaching the ground and it's open underneath, but a tree blows down, there's a dead tree, dead log, dead whatever, deer will use that. Fawns will use that. But generally, you want to have lots of grass, lots of briars, lots of vines, lots of young plants, that young forest, that early successional cover in as many areas as you can provide it.
All the stuff you don't want to walk through.
That's right.
Makes a lot of sense. And that's where, again, talking about the foundation, where do you kick up all the rabbits and the quail and, woodcock and everything else. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to hit on, and I'm going to try to lead you into this as best I can, is anticipating change. I feel like this time of year, when people are scouting, they find, maybe some feed sign or something, and they find some shed antlers, and then they have no idea why they don't even get that buck on camera in that spot. Do you want to touch on how important it is to maybe anticipate what plants are coming up in, late summer, early fall, as well as maybe hit on, if you have information on this, I don't know how we ever could, but maybe like your safest bet oak to target or something along those lines, something with consistency, we'll call it, leading into deer season.
So yeah, leading into deer season, you do have a transition in food sources. Like we talked about earlier, natural forbs and green plants they've been eating are now tougher, mature, gone to seed. They're not as available unless you've done something like some growing season fire. I did my first one last year in June. And the amazing thing was, when I came back to that site in September, You mentioned, you know, all the flowers and butterflies you saw in that area. Well, that's what I saw in September. It was like spring in September. By having that fire in June, you know, I set back succession, started the clock over from zero. And so that in late summer, those plants, and it was things like partridge pea, which is a high quality deer forage and native plant, lots of new blackberry, pokeweed coming up in there, a lot of other plants that butterfly pea that deer browse. But it was in September, and normally you see this flowering and green growth in spring. Well, I had brought it back through growing season fire. So you can, you know, intentionally set back succession and bring high quality forage back in late summer with some growing season fire. Otherwise, what you're going to be seeing is a transition in late summer to, you're going to start to see fruit and mast coming onto the scene. Persimmons are going to start following. Crab apples, if you have fruit like that in your area, are going to start falling. And then some of the early arriving acorns, and then you're going to see deer transitioning away from forage and browse toward those mast sources as they become available. Oaks are notoriously inconsistent producers. That's the trouble. You know, a good the research out of the University of Tennessee has shown that white oaks have a strong acorn year about once every 4 to 5 years. Now, they may have low levels of acorn production in between and some moderate years, but a really good year only comes along, you know, every 4 to 5 years, and it's not predictable and consistent. So it's, you know, other than, you know, getting out there in summer and scouting with binoculars and looking up in the tops of trees for acorns, it's difficult to predict whether or not you're going to have a good year this fall. Now, you've got some, that's why I love planting things like crab apples and persimmons, because they're going to be pretty consistent year to year. They'll have better years than others, but they're always going to have some fruit. So it can serve as your attraction, you know, particularly for early bow season. But yeah, there's really not an oak tree, not a native one, that's, you know, guaranteed to have acorns every single year.
Man, well, I kind of figured that, but I had to ask the professional, because I think that's like one of the more frustrating things as a deer hunter is just figuring out what the oaks are going to do. And, you know, being a guy that hunted ag for years, you can kind of predict. I mean, if there's corn in there this year, pretty likely it's going to be beans the next year, and so on and so forth. You can at least get fairly close and figure out what's going to be planted or whatever. But you go from trying to adjust to those things to now, well, we don't have any white oaks this year. Now what do we do?